I've always been skeptical about ghost stories. You know, the ones people swear happened to them, usually beginning with "I don't believe in ghosts." But I'd roll my eyes, listen politely, and move on. It was nonsense, right? Well, it was. Until it happened to me. It started a few months ago, when I moved into a new apartment complex on the edge of town. I'd just broken up with my girlfriend of for years, and I wanted to get away from the city, the memories, and everything else that reminded me of her. I found this old complex half the price of anything in the city and signed a lease without a second thought. It was old, sure, but cozy in a vintage way. The type of place you could imagine people living in during the 70s. The first night, I didn't notice anything weird. I unpacked my things, settled into my new place, and fell asleep. It wasn't until the third night that I saw her. It was around a.m. I woke up thirsty, the kind of dryness in your throat that demands you get up and drink water no matter how comfortable your bed is. Groaning, I dragged myself to the kitchen. As I filled a glass with water, I glanced out of the small window above my sink. There, on the street below, I saw her for the first time. An old woman. She was standing just beyond the street lamp, cloaked in shadow. I couldn't make out much detail, but something about her seemed wrong. She wasn't moving. She didn't even seem to be looking at anything in particular. She was just standing there, motionless, as if she were waiting for something. I remember feeling a chill creep up my spine, but I dismissed it. This was a quiet neighborhood, maybe she was just some harmless old lady out for a late-night walk. Still, it was unsettling. The next morning, I forgot about it. Work was busy, and by the time I got home, I was exhausted. I didn't think about the old lady until the next night, when I saw her again. Same place, same time, standing just beyond the streetlight. Only this time, she was a little closer. I squinted, trying to see her face, but it was impossible to make out any details in the dark. She was just there, standing still. I told myself not to be paranoid. Old people can be eccentric. Maybe this was just her routine. But then it happened again. And again. Every night. Each night, she was a little closer to my apartment. By the fifth night, she was standing directly under the street lamp, her face still obscured by shadow. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but I was terrified. I felt like a prey animal being watched by something that didn't need to move fast. It was patient, and it was coming for me. Slowly, but surely. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, about the old woman. She had lived in the building for decades, so I figured she would know if the old lady was part of the neighborhood. Old lady? Mrs. Martinez asked, her face wrinkling with confusion. No, I haven't seen any old lady around here. But you should be careful. Careful? Why? There was a woman who lived here years ago. Mrs. Grimshaw. She was strange, very strange. People said she did witchcraft. After her husband died, she became reclusive. Didn't leave her apartment for months, except at night. My heart sank. What happened to her? Mrs. Martinez leaned in, her voice a whisper. She disappeared. Just like that. One day, gone. The police never found her. Some people say she still wanders the streets, looking for something, or someone. I laughed nervously, trying to play it off, but Mrs. Martinez wasn't joking. She grabbed my arm and looked me dead in the eyes. If you see her again, don't look at her. Don't let her follow you. I thanked her and left, feeling more unsettled than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, dreading the moment I would have to look out the window again. Midnight came and went, and eventually, exhaustion took over. I drifted into a restless sleep. But at a.m., I woke up, thirsty, again. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to look out the window. But I couldn't ignore the dry ache in my throat. Slowly, I got out of bed and went to the kitchen. My hands shook as I filled the glass with water, and I forced myself not to look out the window. But I couldn't resist. My eyes darted to the street. She was there. But this time, she wasn't on the street. She was standing right in front of my apartment building. Her head was tilted up, staring directly at my window. I froze, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her eyes on me. I could feel the weight of her gaze, heavy and cold. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to explain what was happening. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, but promised to send someone to check it out. 15 minutes later, the police arrived. I watched from the safety of my apartment as 2 officers got out of their car and looked around. They shined their flashlights up and down the street, but there was no sign of the old woman. The officers knocked on my door. "We didn't see anyone out there, sir," one of them said. "Are you sure you saw someone?" "I'm sure," I insisted. "She was right there, staring at my window." The officers exchanged glances. "We'll keep an eye on the area tonight, but if you see her again, give us a call." They left, and I was alone again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room, every light in the apartment on, watching the window like a hawk. But she didn't come back. For the next few days, I avoided the window. I closed the blinds, tried to go about my life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching, waiting. A week passed without any sign of her, and I started to relax. Maybe it was over. Maybe she had moved on. But then, one night, I heard a knock on my door. I froze. It was too late for anyone to be visiting. The knocking came again, soft but insistent. My stomach twisted with dread. I knew who it was. I don't know how, but I knew. Slowly, I approached the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. I looked through the peephole. She was standing there. The old woman. Her face was pale and gaunt, eyes sunken deep into her skull, but burning with an unnatural intensity. Her lips were cracked and dry, twisted into a thin smile. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at me through the peephole. I stumbled back, heart pounding. I couldn't breathe. I ran to the living room, grabbed my phone, and called the police again. They arrived quickly this time, but when they knocked on my door, the old woman was gone. The officers searched the building, but there was no sign of her. One of them pulled me aside. "Sir, there's no one out there. We've checked the security cameras. No one has come in or out of the building all night." That was impossible. I had seen her. She had been right there, knocking on my door. The next few days were a blur. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. I couldn't focus at work. All I could think about was her. I started seeing her everywhere in the reflection of windows, standing at the corner of the street, watching me from the shadows. She was always there, always watching. I thought about moving out, but the idea of packing up my life in the middle of all this felt impossible. I couldn't think straight, couldn't even make it through a full day without feeling her presence everywhere. But no matter where I went, I knew she'd follow. What good would it do to leave? Maybe she wasn't tied to the apartment. Maybe she was tied to me. A few days after the knocking incident, I tried to confront her. I had gone without sleep for nearly 48 hours, running on caffeine and paranoia. That night, I sat in my living room, waiting for her to show up. I didn't hide from the window. I wanted to see her. I needed to know what she wanted. It was nearly a.m. when I heard the footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. I didn't need to look out the window to know it was her. But this time, I didn't feel fear. I felt angry. How dare she invade my life like this? How dare she make me feel like a prisoner in my own home? I threw open the front door and stepped into the hallway, my heart racing but my mind determined. The hallway was empty, save for the flickering overhead light that cast a dim, yellowish glow on the cracked walls. But I knew she was close. I could feel her presence. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted into the empty hallway. My voice echoed down the long corridor. "What do you want from me?" There was no response. Just silence, thick and suffocating. I stood there, waiting for anything to happen. But nothing did. Defeated, I turned back to my apartment. And that's when I saw her. She was standing in the doorway of the apartment directly across from mine, her gaunt face partially obscured by the shadows. Her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, as if she'd been waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Her presence was oppressive, like a dark cloud pressing down on my chest. "Leave me alone," I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't move, didn't say a word. She just stared at me with those hollow eyes, as if she could see straight through me. Then, slowly, she raised a bony finger and pointed at my apartment door. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I didn't know what she wanted, but I didn't want to find out. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. For what felt like hours, I sat there, waiting for anything to happen. But the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep on the floor by the door. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining and everything seemed normal again. There was no sign of the old woman, no lingering sense of dread. Maybe it was all in my head, I thought. Maybe the lack of sleep was making me see things that weren't there. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that she was gone for good. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next few days passed uneventfully. I went back to work, tried to focus on my job, and told myself that everything was fine. But I could still feel her presence, lingering just at the edge of my awareness, like a shadow that I couldn't escape. It was as if she was always there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to show herself again. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my apartment. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sound was faint, almost like the soft patter of rain against the window. But as I lay there, frozen in bed, I realized it wasn't rain. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in my own bed as the footsteps grew louder. I could hear them now, echoing through the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. I knew she was here. I knew she had finally come for me. I don't know how long I lay there, listening to those footsteps, unable to move. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, right outside my bedroom door. The silence was deafening, and I waited, terrified, for whatever would come next. But nothing happened. I don't know how I finally managed to move, but at some point, I forced myself out of bed. My legs were shaky, and I felt like I might collapse at any moment, but I had to see. I had to know if she was really there. I opened the bedroom door, my heart racing. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been every other time I had looked. But the feeling of her presence was stronger than ever. I could feel her watching me, even though I couldn't see her. She was there somewhere, just out of sight. That's when I knew. I had to leave. I packed a bag that night, threw whatever I could into it, and left the apartment. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away from that place, away from her. I drove for hours, not even sure where I was heading, until I finally found a motel on the outskirts of a neighboring town. I checked in, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed. For the first time in weeks, I slept without seeing her. But when I woke up the next morning, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. I knew she wasn't gone. I knew she would find me, no matter where I went. She wasn't tied to the apartment. She was tied to me. And she was still following me.